There are moments in the Empire when something goes wrong in exactly the right way. A mistake survives peer review, a malfunction gains an audience, and someone somewhere decides to put a frame around it. Welcome to Neural Nonsense, the creativity circuit, where the Empire's most questionable ideas are politely reclassified as culture. I am Schmetterling, and as always, I am accompanied by the measured expertise of Dr. Etherstein.
Expertise which remains perpetually concerned.
Together, we attempt to explain the inexplicable and fail in interesting ways.
We should clarify immediately, this was never meant to be art. What we are discussing today was not approved as an art form.
Yes, and then someone invited critics. If you've been following along, you may remember the Cradle, that delicate, impossible construct designed to hold space-time still long enough to move something fragile through it. If you don't remember, or if that sentence made your temples ache, we recommend going back one episode.
What concerns me is not the cradle itself. It is what happens when people stop asking whether something works and begin asking whether it feels meaningful.
Ah, the precise moment an engineer realizes they've become an artist. What emerged from that moment is now known as cradle needling.
People describe seeing it, but that is inaccurate. They describe being adjusted by it.
Some report visual phenomena, others experience pressure, memory drift, or the sudden certainty that time has politely stepped aside. Quite a few insist nothing happened at all, which is statistically the most worrying outcome. So today we explain how cradle needling works. We'll talk about the artist who makes it, what it feels like to encounter it, and how the Empire is pretending this is perfectly safe.
I would like it noted, for the record, that I object to calling this creative.
Duly noted. Now let's meet the artist. There is a man, not a famous one, not an important one, just a mystic who keeps turning up where he shouldn't, leaving space-time slightly embarrassed as though reality itself has realized it's been teased in public.
Please don't start like this.
Like a bedtime story, very well. There is a mystic, fully trained, fully authorized, and catastrophically mischievous.
That is not a recognized classification.
It should be. And if you'll allow me to tell this without pretending it's a technical briefing, I promise not to make it worse than it already is. You may remember from our previous episode the role mystics play in Imperial travel. They guide ships through subspace, ensuring you reappear where you're meant to, instead of becoming a regrettable footnote between stars. Which makes our artist unusual. He has somehow climbed almost to the top of the Empire's emerging art forms list, despite behaving in ways that would normally earn someone a permanent ban and a delicately worded silence.
And I would like to note that people who behave like this are usually removed from cradle-adjacent work, not promoted within it.
Which is where the rumors begin. The story goes that the Emperor's daughter once flew through one of his works. No entourage, no announcement, an act of rebellion in itself. She stayed longer than advised, and when she emerged, she didn't speak of visions or revelations. She said only that the space didn't want anything from her. After that, certain things slowed, investigations lost urgency, surveillance wandered, protection was never declared, because at that level it rarely is. Power prefers to adjust what counts as important and let the rest fade on its own.
You are turning this into a romance.
Not a romance, an alignment, a man who refuses permanence, who holds space just long enough to be felt and never long enough to be owned, and a woman whose life is defined by ownership of territory, of symbol, of future. Of course, she would notice a place that holds, and then lets go. What people consistently get wrong about this artist is wonderfully simple. He does not draw symbols. There is no carving, no writing, no careful inscription laid on the world like a neat little label that says, "Meaning goes here. Please stand in line." What he does instead is much more irritating and much more elegant. He pierces very gently, very precisely. He introduces absence, tiny pinpricks of nothing pressed into the boundary of a cradle field. Not damage, not violence. Just enough missingness that space-time clears its throat and says, "Excuse me?" And when space-time realizes it has been punctured, it behaves exactly like every good system ever. It panics politely. Color leaks, time stutters. Patterns that were never invited arrive anyway and sit down at the table as if they'd always belonged there. That, annoyingly, is where the symbols come from.
You are describing controlled boundary interference.
I'm describing tattooing, only the skin happens to be causality. People always ask what it's like to encounter one of these spaces, as though there should be a moment you can point to. A threshold, a shimmer, a signal that says, now something is happening. But that's already the wrong expectation. Nothing announces itself. Nothing asks for your attention. You simply keep going, and somewhere along the way you realize the world has become slightly less insistent. It isn't silence, exactly. Sound still arrives, but it seems to take a longer route to reach you. Footsteps feel softer than they should. Distance behaves as though it's reconsidering its priorities. Your own movements lag by a fraction of a thought. Not enough to alarm you, just enough to notice that something has loosened its grip.
This is where descriptions tend to become unreliable.
Yes, because the experience isn't dramatic enough to justify precision. People struggle to explain it, not because it overwhelms them, but because it doesn't. They say things like, "I thought it would do more," or "I'm not sure anything happened," which already tells us everything. They arrived expecting an effect. What they encountered instead was a condition. Inside one of these interruptions, there's no sense of being addressed. The space doesn't respond to you. It doesn't mirror your mood, amplify your thoughts, or reward your curiosity. It simply holds its shape, indifferent to who you are or why you've entered, and that for many people is the unsettling part.
We are conditioned to expect reciprocity.
Exactly. Contemporary art trains us to participate, to be seen, to be reflected back to ourselves in some meaningful way. Here, nothing is interested in your interior life. The space does not care. And in that absence of response, something peculiar happens. People describe a calm, but it's not pleasure and it's not comfort either. It's closer to the absence of interruption. Thoughts don't stop, but they lose their urgency. Emotions still arise, but they don't immediately demand interpretation. There's a sense of being present without performing presence, of existing without being asked to justify it. One visitor described it as being alone without being lonely. Another said it reminded them of standing underwater as a child, when the world is still recognizable but softened by a medium you're not meant to notice.
That response concerns me because from a neurological standpoint, what you are describing resembles a reduction in predictive load. Fewer external variables competing for correction. The brain's constant need to anticipate, adjust, and respond is temporarily underemployed.
You say that like it's a flaw.
I say it like it's a side effect. And side effects become problems when people start seeking them deliberately.
Yes, especially when they realize how loud the world feels afterward. Several visitors have remarked that the most striking moment wasn't being inside the space, but leaving it. Street sounds feel sharper, distances feel more demanding. Time resumes its usual insistence. One woman said, "I didn't realize how much the world was asking of me until it stopped." Because once you've noticed the noise, it's difficult to pretend you haven't.
I find myself increasingly uncomfortable with how calmly you're describing this.
That's because the prank stops being funny here. What began as mischief starts behaving like a question, one that doesn't demand an answer, but also doesn't go away.
From a scientific perspective, that ambiguity is unacceptable.
And perhaps that's why this makes you uneasy, not because it overwhelms the mind, but because it offers it a moment of rest, without permission, without explanation, and without asking whether it's deserved.
I would like to move on.
Of course you would. Next, we should talk about why this becomes dangerous when people start asking how large such a pause could be. The trouble begins, as it so often does, when someone asks a perfectly reasonable question in entirely the wrong tone. Not what is this, but how long could it last? At first, the interruptions are easy to dismiss. A pause inside a ship's corridor. A pocket of air that feels padded. A brief hesitation in space that vanishes before anyone can properly describe it. The sort of thing that gets filed under interesting and then forgotten. But the cradle field doesn't care about our sense of proportion. It doesn't distinguish between a moment and a month, a whisper or a dragon filling the sky. When the artist pierces the bubble's skin, the leaks behave the same whether they are tiny or enormous. They do not escalate. They simply persist.
A distortion that flickers for seconds is aesthetically troubling. A distortion that lingers for hours becomes operationally troubling. And one that spreads across an entire cradle bubble, the size of a small moon, becomes politically dangerous. Once duration and scale combine, the questions change. Meaning becomes management. Interpretation becomes jurisdiction.
Yes, and yet the field behaves the same. No trembling, no strain, no dramatic crescendo, no signal that a boundary has been crossed. It simply holds, longer, larger, with the same quiet confidence as the smallest interruption.
That continuity is precisely the problem.
You're looking unwell, Etherstein.
I am perfectly... No, I am experiencing a temporary drop in blood pressure. It happens occasionally under conceptual strain.
Of course it does. Systems are supposed to wobble as they scale. They're meant to complain, flicker, or threaten collapse. That's how we know where the edges are. People begin to ask, if a moment can be held, why not an hour? If a patch of bubble can rest, why not the whole field? None of this sounds dangerous when phrased gently.
Because it isn't framed as danger. It's framed as relief. Because...
You're pale?
I am aware.
Would you like to sit down?
I am already...
For the record, Etherstein has fainted. A quiet disagreement between his body and the idea that resolution might be optional. We'll give him a moment. Next, we should talk about why the Empire officially insists this art form is harmless, and why that insistence is doing more damage than the prank ever did. And before we continue, gratitude is in order. The gallery has updated our arrangements. Apparently, we've attracted enough attention that they've invited us to stay indefinitely. Whether that is generosity or surveillance, I will leave to your judgment. And now we ask, how exactly did something this strange come to be declared officially harmless? Because that answer tells us far more about the Empire than the art ever could. Once something begins making the Empire nervous, a very specific process unfolds. First, it is studied, then it is classified, and finally, it is declared safe.
Safe is a rather optimistic word for it. In formal terms, the sequence is closer to investigation, containment, measurement, modeling, classification, and then certification within acceptable risk parameters. Which is to say, not harmless, merely tolerable.
Or in this case, the official position is quite clear. Cradle needling is not dangerous. It is not disruptive. It does not pose a risk to infrastructure, cognition, or public morale. It is, according to the Art Ministry's own phrasing, an aesthetically unusual but operationally negligible spatial irregularity.
And indeed, we all must note the wording was very carefully chosen.
Yes, it took 6 committees and 1 mild nervous breakdown. People who encounter this phenomena are encouraged to move through the space at a natural pace, which is a fascinating instruction given that no one can quite remember what their natural pace was before they entered.
That is not a flaw, it is a wording issue.
Ah, my favorite kind. There is also a waiver, there is always a waiver. This one assures participants that any sensation of calm, clarity, or existential lightness is purely coincidental and should not be interpreted as meaningful.
Meaning is not a regulated outcome.
Internally, the memos are less relaxed. Phrases like non-escalating persistence begin to appear. So do footnotes clarifying that persistent does not imply permanent, followed by several pages explaining why permanence is, in fact, extremely unlikely.
Those clarifications are important.
One particularly memorable document proposes a solution: placing informational signage near known sites of interruption. The suggested wording is, "You may experience a temporary reduction in urgency."
That is not inaccurate.
No, it's just wonderfully optimistic. Another department suggests counter-programming, ambient sound, subtle movement, gentle reminders that time is, in fact, still passing.
That proposal was rejected.
Yes, on the grounds that it made the space feel lonely. Which brings us to my favorite contradiction. The Empire insists cradle needling is harmless. It also insists it must be monitored, continuously, by people who are told not to linger.
Monitoring does not imply concern.
No, it implies paperwork. And at some point someone suggests a ban, quietly, sensibly. The suggestion is acknowledged, noted, and placed into a category labelled premature, which is Empire speak for we don't know how.
Bans are blunt instruments.
So is pretending nothing is happening. You're sweating again, Etherstein.
I am warm.
This is what happens when mischief becomes policy adjacent. The prank survives long enough to demand a response, and the response arrives wearing a calm expression and carrying a clipboard. The joke, of course, is that clipboards are terrible at holding pauses.
I strongly object to
And that would be fainting number 2. Don't worry, he's breathing. He's just temporarily overwhelmed by the concept of an officially harmless interruption that refuses to stop being interesting. We'll take a short break. When we return, we should probably attempt something reckless. Closure. After a pause, things usually resume. That's the contract we live by. Traffic moves again. Conversations pick up where they left off. Systems conclude, files close, and whatever unsettled us is folded neatly back into the category marked handled. Cradle needling, unfortunately, is very bad at endings. The Empire would prefer closure. A final assessment, a sentence that begins with "in summary" and ends with "no further action required." And in some ways it gets exactly that. The spaces fade, the distortions loosen, the bubble releases its grip, and the world continues, obediently noisy once more. Nothing remains that can be measured, and yet people don't leave empty-handed. They leave with a comparison they didn't have before, a memory of what it felt like when the world asked a little less of them, when urgency briefly lost its authority, when presence didn't require justification. That knowledge is remarkably difficult to archive.
I object to framing this as knowledge.
Very well. Experience, then. Or perhaps suspicion. A quiet doubt about whether all this pressure is as inevitable as we've been told. The mystic never returns to claim credit. He leaves the way he arrived, without explanation, without permission, and without waiting to see whether he's been understood.
I would prefer to believe this will not continue.
Of course you would, but art has a habit of outliving the arguments against it, especially when it doesn't ask to be preserved, especially when it refuses permanence as a principle. Perhaps that's the most unsettling thing about cradle needling, not that it bends spacetime or unsettles policy, or causes perfectly competent scientists to faint twice in one conversation, but that it suggests something quietly heretical, that a system does not have to resolve in order to function, that a pause does not have to be justified to be allowed, that not everything unfinished is broken.
I remain unconvinced.
I know, but you did wake up both times, and so we leave this as we found it, without a conclusion, without a lesson neatly underlined, and without any clear instructions on what to do next, which I suspect is exactly the point. This has been neural nonsense, the creativity circuit. If you feel slightly out of sync with the world when you stand up again, don't worry. That sensation tends to fade. Mostly,